We're just waiting on a few more people to join. But as always, if anyone has questions throughout the session, please feel free to submit them in the chat box, and we'll hopefully be able to answer them during the session. So we'll wait another minute or so. So hello everyone. Thank you for joining. If you're just tuning in now, welcome to the book launch of Global Taiwanese by Fiona Moore. My name is Brianna Muir, and I am an Associate Marketing Manager at the University of Toronto Press. So during the book launch, Fiona will be joined by Dorothy A. Yen and Mrs. Wang. Unfortunately, Elena Giovanni is unable to participate in today's webinar, but Dorothy has kindly offered to step in and moderate the event. So before we begin the book launch for Global Taiwanese, we would just like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto Press operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Okay.
Hello.
Oh, hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you for joining us. Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
This is Reding calling. I'm checking in from Taipei.
Oh, yes. Wonderful. Glad you can make it. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce Fiona, the author of Global Taiwanese. So Fiona is the professor of business anthropology at Royal Holloway, University of London. Her current research focuses on ways of developing ethnography as a method for studying international business. She is also an award-nominated science fiction author. So joining Fiona today is Raulin Hesayo, and he is the professor at the Graduate Institute of Technology, Innovation, and Management at National Chiang Kai University, Taiwan, with an adjunct appointment at NSU Business School at the National University of Singapore. His research interests span across infotech-enabled change, technology, sense-making, innovation under adversity, and creative cities. So also joining the panel is Mrs. Wang, and Mrs. Wang has been a very active member of the National Taiwan University Alumni Association in Toronto. And Mrs. Wang was also a very key informant during the Toronto phase of Fiona's study. So it is now also my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Dorothy A. Yen. And so Dorothy is professor in marketing at the Brunel Business School at Brunel University, London, where she specializes in marketing, branding, and tourism. Dorothy is particularly interested in exploring how culture affects human behavior and focused areas in cross-cultural business relationships, film branding, social media practices, tourism boycotts, and also contributes to the debate of Anglo-Chinese business relationships. So thank you everyone for joining in, and I will now turn things over to Dorothy to begin the panel conversation.
So thank you very much for everybody to coming into this session today. I think I'm just looking see if we got any questions coming from the participants, but so far I can't see any just yet. So I'm going to invite Fiona to give a brief talk about what this book is about and what motivated her to start this project.
Okay, thank you, Dorothy. Right, this book is one of these ones where, you know, it's a cliche to say it's a journey, but you know, it is a journey, I have to say, and one with a rather long genesis. Back in 1998 through 2001, I did my doctoral research which was on German German international managers in London, working mostly in the financial industry. My interest was in how they use their ethnic identities in their careers as global business people. And so I hung around various German banks in London. I studied this, I wrote a thesis. Some years later, I'd always right from the start been interested in doing some kind of comparative study, looking at how the experiences of other diaspora groups with a business focus operate in this setting. So I initially set out to do a study of Chinese business people, and after about 3 months of trying this and not really getting anywhere with this, my colleague Chin-Ju Tsai at the Royal Holloway, an organization studies specialist, suggested that I try focusing on Taiwan. And I had not thought of this, but the more I looked into the Taiwanese as a distinct business group, the more fascinated I was with the complicated way in which Taiwanese people build their identities and develop them. And I also began to focus more on skilled labor migrants rather than on people who had formerly expatriated. The Germans were more people who were working specifically for companies. They were with Deutsche Bank. They moved to London to work for Deutsche Bank. Then they would move back to Frankfurt to work for Deutsche Bank, where Taiwan saw a much more networked migration pattern. People would come to London to study, they would meet other Taiwanese people, they would decide to stay for a while, then they would move maybe back to Taiwan, but maybe on to other parts of the world. And that struck me as very interesting. And my research began to follow this pattern, because after a couple of years of studying in London, Royal very kindly invited me to come to Taipei to NCCU to do some work there. And not long after that, I was able to get some grant money to continue the study in Toronto, which is incidentally, for the audience, where I was born and where I grew up. So I have a lot of family and a lot of awareness of the local culture. So it was by way of insider ethnography there as well. All of which, and one of the reasons why I mentioned that this study has its roots in the earlier German study, is because this book has a couple of functions. One of it is as an ethnography of a multi-sided ethnography of Taiwanese skilled labor migrants and in different sites around the world. But some of it's also revisiting the globalization theories that were predominant when I was doing my doctoral research and my other research on Germans. And sort of saying, okay, you know, it's been 20 years. A lot has changed. Some people are saying globalization is coming to an end. Some people not so much. How about we take some of the theories, and in particular, I focused on Manuel Castell's theories of, oh no, sorry people, the network society, to see.
Research assistant coming.
Yes. I think the reason my students come to class these days to see if the cat's going to show up. Anyway, to carry on. So in part, this is also testing theories of globalization and developing them, because part of what I found was that really what we have to do, I think, is focus less on globalization as a unified phenomenon and more as a group of phenomena which are global, but you can't really say that, to take my case cities, that Toronto, London, and Taipei are the same sort of place, even though all three of them are very global cities.
Thank you, Fiona. I would also like to invite other panelists to comment on this. The fact that London, Toronto, and Taipei were all chosen as global city, but our understanding of them being global is slightly different. So maybe we can start from Mrs. Wang commenting, and then we'll move on to Ruling, and then maybe myself will also commenting slightly on how my view about how they differ. So Mrs. Wang, we'll let you start first, please.
For the moment, I have no comments yet.
Okay.
Later on.
Okay, Ruling, what do you think about London, Taipei, and Toronto? Ruling, you're on mute.
You're muted.
I'm mute. Okay, I open now. Now, first of all, actually I feel very happy to actually host Fiona in Taipei, especially when she talked about she wants to study the subject of Taiwanese as a global phenomenon, which is amazed me because my study also work with some about a local and global issue. For example, we study 7-Eleven. How does it move from Japan to Taiwan? And then it become a very different 7-Eleven. So how does it go? So when she talk about Taiwanese globally, so I'm thinking about 7-Eleven, you know, that's sort of a scenario. So Taiwanese when they move to different area like London or Toronto, would they become very different? So that's why when Fiona is in NCCU, we have a few chat about this issue. One of the issue that I raise is the identity, which also in this book, which I find very fascinating. How do you construct identity to actually mobilize business network? And I remember I have a question for her, and I don't know whether Fiona remember or not, because Taiwanese identity is slightly sophisticated. Now, sometimes the Taiwanese call themselves Chinese. Sometimes they call themselves Taiwanese, which is, you know, very subtle because when you say Taiwanese, it refers to invaders, you know, invade aborigines. And then sometimes you become, Taiwanese refer to themselves to colonies of American, which is, you know, which is kidding. And then, so they have this very sophisticated identity. And also a link to Japanese. So how do you actually understand the sophisticated identity and use that as a way to mobilize business network? So I'm actually quite look forward to hear more from Fiona to talk about this subject. Over to host.
Fiona, would you like to comment on this first, and then I'll join in to talk about the Taiwanese in London and how we become not just Taiwanese but sometimes also British. Fiona, you're on mute.
Yes, indeed. Yes, we all do this. No, well, this is one of the things I find fascinating. I mean, you know, it's for me as an outsider who's had the privilege of participating in these different communities, the complexities of the Taiwanese identity are so fascinating, and the different discourses, and how they. One of the issues that I started having as I did the literature is that quite often the literature is decontextualized. As you say, sometimes they will treat Taiwan as China, you know, just Taiwan, you know, is China, and any differences between the two are not really worth. And in fact, historically, one of the classic ethnographies of Taiwan, or what we now acknowledge as one of the classic ethnographies of Taiwan, was initially written as an ethnography of China. And, you know, and it was later, the name was later changed from Chinese farm to Taiwanese farm to acknowledge there is a difference. But at the same time, there is a difference. And, you know, this is, which is not, on the other hand, to diminish the Chinese influence over Taiwan or the Chinese culture in Taiwan, but also to say that there are complexities, there are differences between different groups of migrants, the pre-1948 and the post-1948. Within modern Taiwan, there is discourses about, are we more like mainland China or are we more like Singapore, to a Southeast Asian nation that's a majority Chinese. And also there is the issue of the Japanese colonial connection as well, which is still strong and quite, often acknowledged. So this is something, for the benefit of, I'm going to explain in a minute, but I'm pretty sure some of the people in the audience understand what I would say if I say that I'm theoretically, I am a Goffmanian. I follow the work of Irving Goffman, and in particular his views of identity as performance. And so it seems to me Taiwanese identity is one that very much lends itself to this theory, and that people can present themselves as Chinese, as Taiwanese, as something else entirely, as Chinese, but different to mainland Chinese. I had one connection in London who, adopted Taiwanese identity the roundabout way. He was a member of the KMT party, and then became Taiwanese through his membership of the KMT, rather than settling in Taiwan and things following from there. So it's fascinating and complicated. I don't think I've even scratched the surface of it. And so it's slightly, these days, I tend to get a little bit harsh on papers I see presented where they say, okay, we're going to talk about a Taiwanese firm. I'm like, okay, which firm, when, how long, how old are the owners? You sort of notice that there's a Japanese connection, but you don't seem interested in investigating why there's a Japanese connection. Context, people, context.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fiona. I think maybe I can also contribute slightly
Yes,
on
please.
the identity. My understanding is that identity is very fluid. And also when we talk about identity performance, it could be very swift as well. So being a Taiwanese in London, I certainly experienced this identity kind of, it's not identity change, but I would say we certainly acculturated and acquired a second identity. And my own background is similar to a lot of the Taiwanese in Taiwan. When I was growing up, I was told I'm Chinese. So I thought I was Chinese until later on I realized actually I'm not just Chinese, I'm also Taiwanese. And I need to make sure that I project my voice as Taiwanese. When I come over to the UK, I wasn't in London, I was in the north, and then I gradually traveled down from Leeds and then Manchester and then Worcester and then down in London. I realized that my identity gradually increased. I got another dimension, which is I started accumulating this British identity. And the best thing about being pragmatic Taiwanese is that we can enact the identity that is deemed as most appropriate for the situation where it seems as best fit. So sometimes I would say, oh yeah, I'm Taiwanese. Sometimes I say, oh, I speak Chinese and I have Chinese culture in me. Ask me anything about Chinese culture and I can give you a lecture. But often, sometimes I hear myself saying, oh my God, we're British people, we don't do this. Oh, this is just so not British. So there is identity fluidity in everyday conversation. And I think that's one thing about Taiwanese is because of the historical events and context, we are very ready to embrace new identity where it sees as needed. And I think it offers as a kind of sense of security and protection at times. Yeah. I think I answered one of the questions that's posted here. It's to what extent do Taiwanese identities become increasingly Britishified as they become acclimatized and settled in Britain, especially London? So, okay, so how does say thank you? So we answered that question. Brilliant. Okay. There is also another question that I think maybe some of the participants would find it interesting is when we talk about 中国 versus 中华. So 中国 clearly has an indication in terms of as a nation, right? So 中国, if we translate that into English, that would be China. But 中华 is Chinese, and 中华 is owned by not just the mainland Chinese, but also a lot of other Chinese people or Taiwanese people who see then also sharing ownership of this very important term. So maybe we could invite all the panelists to comment on this. And maybe we'll start from Fiona.
Okay, yeah. One of the interesting things I found starting in the London phase particularly was that I was talking in London to particularly to quite a lot of students and other younger people who were involved with social activities in the way that young people do. And one of the things I noticed was I would ask about who they socialize with, and kind of to what extent this has their socialization has to do with their identity as Taiwanese, their other identities. And one of the things I noticed was quite a lot of them said that they felt more comfortable. They would socialize with other Taiwanese young people, but they would also find themselves more comfortable socializing with Malay Chinese and Hong Kongese and diaspora Chinese in Europe. The study predates Brexit, but still, it's that phase of the study predates Brexit, but it still reads. And, that there was much more of a kind of an identification with people who were Chinese, but also, Zhonghua, also from not necessarily living in Zhongguo. And then they would associate less with the mainland Chinese, the people who had Zhonghua and Zhongguo. And so see this also with the students. It's quite interesting to see who identifies as Chinese and who identifies as Chinese plus, the ones who will say, I'm Chinese, but I'm Hong Kongese, I'm Chinese, but I'm Mongolian. That's another one that comes up very much as a distinct identity. So yeah. It seems like there is a different sort of experience. And speaking from this is a Canadian institution hosting this, I could also say maybe you can think about the difference between France and La Francophonie, the idea of a global Frenchness versus actually being from France. So, the Taiwanese identity and its relationship to Chinese identity is complicated, but, in a way that has resonances with other identities as well.
Thank you, Fiona. Raylene, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, Chonghua is particularly a very interesting issue that I like in this book, because I think when I try to translate the Zhonghua, at the first look, I don't understand what that is, but when I spell it, then I understand Fiona is talking about Zhonghua, which I think is quite critical because, for example, I'll give you a few examples of how Taiwanese network in a kind of a new situation, a new business setting. For example, if you are networking wherever you are, when you're networking with a group of people from mainland China, then you are often embarrassed by people asking you some political issue. So which one of the Chinese do you agree? Which one of China do you agree? Then you try to avoid that, but you still have to build up and maintain the business contact. How do you do that? then Chonghua will be very important. When you say, oh, we all from Zhonghua Wenhua, the culture of Zhonghua. And then all in a sudden, it seems that this political division kind of fade away, and people begin to relate to each other. For example, when you refer to the culture of Zhonghua, and people begin to talk about poetry. I don't know whether you have come across this situation. So once upon in a meeting, and one of particular guests kind of asked me a poetry issue, and said, so we talk about poetry, then we recite the poetry, we recite the whole poetry from Shu Dongpo, and then all in a sudden, there's no political division or political issue, then we become very good friends. So you construct your identity through this kind of Chonghua culture. I think that is one of the fascinating issue that I see in Fiona's book.
Thank you, Railing. Mrs. Wang, do you have anything would you like to add?
No, to me, I'm a little bit different. My concept of China is quite different as now, because all the time I grow up, I'm thinking about mainland China. It's completely different after I went to visit later on. I found out I idealized communist theory and so on, completely different. I feel they are so capitalist more than the people from Taiwan. So it's very difficult for me to say anything about that. But Fiona's book mentioned about 外省人,本省人, to me, that's when I have a little bit concept about that. And I have to say, I'm neither. And the whole thing, because I grew up in the war zone timing. The whole China is always in the war. The Communist Party and the Kuomintang Party, they really brutal, killing each other very terribly. So I never really in Kuomintang, but our family moved there because my father was relatively richer, because he said at that time, the concept of Communist Party, they kill all those people who is rich, right? So to me, the concept is so different now. And all the time, Fiona talking about those China, my concept of China is quite different. And in my later work, they always send all the Chinese people under me because they're always grievance and so on. So I'm the only female, they cannot sue me. And I'm also Chinese race. So to them, it's easy, they cannot sue me. And I had all the difficulty handle the newly immigrant from China working in Toronto, because all the complaint, I understand, but I talk differently. So to me, it's a little bit different concept. And I don't think I really answered the question, but the way I think about Chinese, I will say it's 人情味. I don't know how to translate that. For example, my Chinese friend, they come to Toronto, they're looking for a job. The husband has a PhD, the wife has 2 masters, but they couldn't find any job. So they lived in Riverdale, Chinatown. And the wife said, they rent a flat. They went downstairs, restaurant asking, so can I clean the floor, helping around. And after they heard about husband and wife all has academic high degree, they completely different, they lower the rent. They even tell them, say, oh, don't worry, you will find a job. We are the one grown up in Chinatown, always working in restaurant. We don't have much future. You are the one with future. That to me is a 人情味, and to me can expand any kind of Chinese. So I don't know how to expand that in English. Anyway, that's my brief talking.
Thank you, Mrs. Wang. I can actually add on to your discussion about Renqing because I actually studied it because my research part of it was Guanxi. So I studied Guanxi and I worked it out how to evaluate and measure Guanxi. And one of the key thing is Renqing. Renqing is basically an exchange, a reciprocal exchange of favors. So when one
But that's
party,
not in that way.
I think,
I
but
don't
then
know how
that
to
goes
explain
down.
it.
Yeah, but that goes down to it's also affection and this
Yeah.
this caringness. That's also part of Renqing because Renqing, the direct translation is human affection, right? So we
Yes.
are exchanging human affection. Sometimes in objects like presents and gifts or even dumplings or food. And sometimes it is through the exchange of gifting, we are trying to share and express our caringness and our emotion towards the other party. But sometimes renting is demanded as a return or requested as a return. That happens at times. But one thing I did notice, it was really interesting discussion, is that I think culture is self-developing and evolving and changing all the time. So the kind of Chinese or Taiwanese we seen and we experienced 30 years ago is naturally going to be quite different from the Taiwanese or the Chinese we sing and befriend with nowadays. And I also noticed that in my own experience and interaction with colleagues from different parts. But then also going back to Ruling's comment about the difference between Chinese as a culture where we can share as a common ground and to engage in meaningful discussions versus China as a nation where it has clear boundary. I think that's a really interesting conversation to have if we're looking further about identity of Taiwanese and how they navigate these two different terminologies, isn't it? Okay, have we got any more questions from the participant? If not, then I think I got another question for Fiona. During your book, you talked about the different cities, and then you talked about the sojourner status of Taiwanese in London versus more of a settler status of those Taiwanese in Toronto. Could you just elaborate a little bit more about this and their differences, please?
Okay, thanks. Well, one of the interesting contrasts between Toronto and London, and one of the things that kind of has driven interest in the study in other areas actually has been the fact that although London, the UK has a very complicated, well, both the UK and Canada have complicated relationships with immigration, but in different ways. So in London, London is a very global city, has quite possibly been a global city since the ancient Romans, but it's in a country which until very recently was a net exporter of people rather than importer of people. Only since really the 1970s have more people been coming to the UK than leaving it. And London, although it's always been anomalous, it's always been that kind of, if you like, that exception that's nonetheless part of the culture. You know, there is this idea that London is a bustling international hub, but the idea is that the people don't stay. And to be fair, even the British don't stay in London. You know, 90% of the time, if you ask somebody in London and they're, British to the core, and you'll find out they're actually, they're from well outside London and they're planning to go back there. You see so many people. It is not that surprising that there is. But it does mean that regardless of the fact that quite a lot of people settle, there is still this norm, this value, if you like, that people who coming to the UK, that's fine, but don't stay. move on, go back home or move on to the next thing. Whereas Canada has a different relationship in that Canada historically has been a net importer of people. And a big part of Canadian identity has been the idea of the immigrant experience that, your parents came from somewhere else, or your grandparents, or, your great grandparents even, but still, generally speaking, I think most Canadians, if they don't have a parent who's a migrant, they have a grandparent who's a migrant. It is usually within a couple of generations. And this is not the complicated side of this is that this is not as universally positive as Canadians like to make out. They have one of the things that's been emerging in the last year has been quite a lot of pushback to the Canadian narrative of inclusiveness, pointing out historic incidents of discrimination. And again, against Chinese and ethnically Chinese people, there are huge, horrible histories of discrimination and prejudice in the Canadian environment. And yet also at the same time, the norm, the value is that if you come to Canada, you stay, or you should stay. Maybe, the example that I give in the book and that I think almost crystallizes it is that was when I realized that you see adverts from lawyers on the subway in London and in Toronto, and they're adverts for immigration lawyers. But the ones in London are all helping people to emigrate to the USA. And the ones in Toronto are all advertising their services in bringing your family over from wherever it is you've left your family. So that's a very different attitude. And again, people say, but people don't always stay in Toronto. In fact, one of the interesting things was that most of the people I talked to who were Taiwanese in Toronto did not intend to stay in Toronto. They were all intending to come and move on somewhere else or go back, or and in some cases they did move on, but then they came back to Toronto. But there is nonetheless this attitude. And where I actually kind of seem to see it more in some ways is in the children and the grandchildren. Because with the British cohort, the children of my interviewees, they were very much encouraged to embrace their Chinese and or Taiwanese identity. They were sent to language lessons. They were, their parents would, one area where I sort of was interested but didn't quite, wasn't able to do quite as much investigation as I'd have liked was actually in the Buddhist temple in central London, where patterns of it tends to involve, kind of where you're old and when you want your children to start learning things. But anyway, whereas in Toronto, people were saying, well, when they're older, they can decide. And if they want to learn Chinese when they're older, then I'll let them. But if they just see themselves as Canadian, then that's okay. So, it was kind of telling, in terms of the approaches to their children and the host country.
Thank you, Fiona. That's really interesting. Any of our panelists would like to comment on this question?
Yes, I actually have some question also. I collect some question for Fiona from NCCU, my colleagues. But one of the interesting question I see in this book is the constructing of identity in a variety of ways, then to mobilize business network. I find this very fascinating. Sometimes, for example, in Singapore, for example, I stayed in Singapore for quite a while. In Singapore, sometimes when you are networking with the Singapore Chinese, and then you have to use Hokkien way. I don't know whether it's kind of a local dialect. You use Hokkien to actually bring together the relationship, and quickly, for some reason, as probably what you say, the personal affection or 关系 related personal affection. People somehow, when you talk about this dialect, and people just tick, and all in a sudden become a good friend. And in the Silicon Valley, which I have a few friends there, you talk about, especially when you mention that you have this Taiwanese background, you talk about technology background, because technology background is very much somehow is kind of a magical ingredient when you talk about technology. And in Silicon Valley, Taiwanese, and then more than they just talk about, Acer, ourselves, TSMC, all that sort of thing, and they become good friends very quickly. And so birthplace, accent, technology background, these are some of the way that construct identity. But in your book, do you have a way to categorize some of these strategies of constructing identity to mobilize business network? I mean, this is a question that I hope that Fiona can enlighten us a few.
Okay, categorize maybe less so, but identify definitely. Definitely there is, it's good that they mentioned technology as well, because that was a big part of it. The association of Taiwanese-ness with proficiency in technology was one way that people would construct international networks. And like in one case, in a couple of cases, there were people who had moved from STEM careers to more social careers, and were saying that, there was nonetheless this kind of social, oh, you're Chinese, you know computers, that thing that kind of influenced how they were at work. Also, I found alumni networking was a part of it. And you say about the Singaporeans, I noticed this too, because I also, spent a lot of time in Singapore, officially teaching, but I'm an anthropologist. I don't not observe. And what you say about the Guanxi and the networks, I notice it. I notice the students, they come, they say, oh yes, I really liked your class. And then they will say, you must stay with my family when you are next in Singapore. And of course, I know some of my colleagues are sort of like, what, this is just inappropriate. This is not, this is not the British way. You don't get that social. I'm like, they're not being social. They're just trying to, this is Guanxi, they're just trying to say, let us form a relationship of favors. Language is something I cannot participate in, but so it's interesting that you do. But I also, I noticed that language, and I think I've got a large section on language as a way of shared language, but also shared multilinguality. The fact whether you can speak, Hanyu, and but also that you speak Holo or Hokkien or Hakka, is another way of building the connections, and reflects very different identities within and can be leveraged in very different ways to build up your network and make the connections you need for your career.
Fiona, following that questions, I think it would be really good timing for you to answer another question from the audience,
Okay.
which I'll read it out. It's from Derek. And Derek says, I understand Fiona's book and this conversation covers mainly London and Toronto. Do you think the Taiwanese culture and identity varies by geography outside of Taiwan, like in the US?
I think very much so. I mean, I never got an opportunity to study American Taiwanese. I mean, there might be an opportunity for some follow-up work coming up, but I don't want to say anything in case it all falls through. But that is certainly a direction that I would have loved to have taken the study had I had the chance. Mostly just for personal interest. I tend to follow items about American Taiwanese in the news. And, from it, I get the sense that, the relationship, the political relationship is very also complicated, but again, different to London and to Taiwan. And there's actually a very good article, which I read a while back, and I reference it in the book, but it's by Berner and Yu, and it's about how baseball is used as a symbol of identity connecting America, Taiwan, and the Taiwanese diaspora in America. And interestingly, though they don't really go into this, it's also something connecting them to Japan, because Japan is the other area of Asia where there is a major interest in and proficiency in baseball. So these sorts of symbols of identity, they can be as simple or as you wouldn't necessarily think that baseball would be a point through which people connect, and yet it can be a point of connection. You like baseball. What teams do you follow? What do you think of this player? Do you think that this other country will field a team? Things like that. So. It can be, there are no easy ways to categorize and associate it, but there are lots of fascinating ways to kind of trace patterns and see how these things are built.
I would think that it makes perfect sense to study American Taiwanese, because I remember when I was little, there was a common phrase says, go study to the US. It's like as if we have this propaganda trying to send people to the US, and US is clearly the largest destination of overseas Taiwanese. Yeah.
Well, there's also political initiatives. I mean, when Donald Trump acknowledges Taiwan, and Twitter goes on fire, and in the meantime, somebody points out that there is a strong Taiwanese American connection in the more mainstream Republican Party. So they don't think this is entirely an accident that a man who doesn't really know very much about Taiwan suddenly says something about Taiwan that pleases certain other people. So so it can be these. The US, has historically used its universities, its tech industries, and so forth, not just for overt power, but for soft power, for ways of saying, kind of we building up our knowledge resources, as it were, by encouraging people from outside the US to come and study in the US. And then, of course, some of them stay, maybe for a short time, maybe for their whole lives, but having the universities with a big international student base is one of the ways in which historically the US builds up knowledge, it builds up international goodwill, builds up research and development connections that can be maybe useful, maybe not so useful, but in a generalized sort of way, I suspect it pays off more than it doesn't. And interestingly, this is also one of the ways in which Canada benefits, because again, the story I heard over and over in Canada was I was trying to get to the US and I couldn't. So I came to Toronto or to Vancouver or whatever. And some of that was university. I wanted to study in California, but I couldn't get the visa. Meanwhile, I could get a visa to study in Canada. So I said, I'll go to Canada. I will study there and then maybe do graduate school in the US. And then by the time the opportunity for graduate school turns up, they're married, they have a child. So again, my point, as it with outside of anthropology, but within international business, switching my hat slightly, IB often tends to be decontextualized and not really ask why a business is located where it is, or why a particular, I'm writing a chapter at the moment for a textbook on global talent management, and there's knowledge resources in a particular area, but not somewhere else. So why? People say, oh, we must go where the talent is. They don't ask, why is there this particular talent base in this particular area? But you need to ask why, because it affects your business. It can, in good and bad ways. And also, if you're going to leverage these resources, if you're going to leverage these networks, then you need to understand where it's coming from and why it is where it is.
Yeah, very much agree with you. On that note, I think there is also another really interesting question, which is about the role of digital technology in enabling the network society. Would you like to comment on it?
Oh yeah, well, it's fascinating, and though it's also not every anthropologist I know is studying the digital right now because we can't actually go into the field apart, but we can go into the chat rooms. Nonetheless, it is really it's a huge resource, and it goes back further than people think. One of the things I find interesting is that in principle, early studies of internet communities, including a very early study around 2000 of a Taiwanese Usenet group, the technology changes, the technology improves, but the basic principle hasn't. And that is that there is no direct separation between the online and the offline. The first thing people do when they move abroad is they find ways of maintaining connections with home. When they move to a third place, they will carry on having connections with home and with the place they've left. And they also provide fascinating ways of embracing and expressing complicated identities. So, for instance, I join a Facebook group with permission for Taiwanese film fans in London, because yes, the science fiction author hat on, I like movies. I also find you can find fascinating amounts about a country by looking at its movies. But again, this means that you can express your identity as Taiwanese, but also as a film fan, or even just as somebody who appreciates film from Taiwan in a way that offline identities don't necessarily allow. You can and it struck me very much how many of the people in my study were connected to the digital, in some ways professionally. Quite a lot of people, especially in Taipei, were working in the games industry, especially, but also beyond that in their social lives and their personal lives, and in the way they maintained relationships, connections. And I find, the development of gaming and games and virtual environments to be kind of where things are going. I mean, people are using them for socialization. Well, they used them for socialization before. With the pandemic, it's becoming much more of a way of connecting with people and of staying connected with friends, and having activities that you can do that are not limited to a single location. So this is with the pandemic. I mean, it's a cliche to say, the pandemic is developing new ways of interacting that will persist post-pandemic. But but it's true, and it's also going to be very, very unpredictable. And I like this. I'm looking forward to seeing how Taiwanese identity develops with the digital world.
Brilliant. Okay, we only have 7 minutes to go, so I'm going to encourage the audience to send us your questions, because we'll probably only be able to take one more question.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're going to see if anybody got in for the last question. While we're waiting for people to send us the question, I would also like to comment on the digital technology and how that enabled networking. I remember in my early days, first coming over to learn, to Britain, I realized that the Taiwanese really enjoy using emojis in all of our digital conversations. We are masters of emojis. And that applies to the kind of social media platform that we use. So for example, in Taiwan, a lot of people prefer to use Line, because Line has all these different kind of stickers where you could use So you don't have to say thank you, but you can put a sticker that just kind of send heart out. So that is your thank you. And you don't need to be sarcastic, because you can actually use a sarcastic sticker where the sticker says everything. And I realized that nowadays, because of COVID, actually, I see more and more colleagues from other different cultures started embracing emoji, which I didn't notice before. And I can see that especially the younger generation, the younger generation always embrace new technology much earlier than the others. But even the adults started using more emoji, which is quite interesting, because maybe because the fact that we can't see each other face to face made emoji more important as a facilitator or a communication aid in our daily digital conversations.
Yeah, there's one question I've noticed in the chat. Kim Wong asks, are there any differences you observe in Taiwanese versus in tech sector versus other sectors? I would say the arts sector in London has got a very distinctive identity. There's a culture that kind of surrounds St. Martin's College. And I think Berlin and Dorothy, you know exactly what I mean, but, you know, very much this kind of modern art, modern design culture that, you know, is very much part of the identity of the people working in the arts community. Between tech and finance, it was a little less clear, you know. But then again, I think there was a bit more elision. There were a lot of Taiwanese who were in London who were ostensibly working in finance, but in practice, it was in the IT department, for instance. So it can be a little harder to separate those identities. One point about the emoji. In linguistic anthropology, when people started using telephones, one of the things they noticed is that people used back channel. They said and a lot more than they do in face-to-face communication. So emoji, this is an obvious development of you know, textual based chat, because similarly, the reason you say and ah on the telephone is because you can't see people's faces, and in the text you can't hear people's ums and ahs, so you have to send pictures. What I think is interesting is how normalized they become, how they start coming into professional. You know, when I started in academia, it would be absolutely rude to send a smiley to a colleague. But now, you know, colleagues are including, like, you know, raised eyebrow emojis and things in their messages. So, you know.
I think maybe nowadays, because of our mobile phone all enabled all this kind of emoji, made it easier for us to send emoji. But originally I was going to say that I think there's also a cultural difference there. I think emoji helps people from the more kind of implicit way of communicating.
Yes.
So you don't have to be as black and white. Yeah. Okay. I think we're going to close this now. So Brianna is in now. Yeah.
Hi, Brianna.
Hi, everyone. That was a wonderful conversation. I really liked what you mentioned earlier about sort of identity being very much a performance and having a very fluid concept within sort of not only business transactions, but social sort of networking within Britain and Taiwan and Canada. So that was really interesting. So yes, I would like to thank Fiona and Dorothy, Mrs. Wong and Rulin. Really appreciate everyone for sort of joining in today's webinar and book launch. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions and tuned in. Here is a copy of Global Taiwanese. And if you're interested in learning more and purchasing a copy, we've added the link to purchase right in the chat box on the side there. So here it is. Great. Well, thank you everyone very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening and afternoons. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for doing such a good job moderating, Dorothy. Thank you for taking part, Mrs. Wong and Rilin, and thank you for making all this happen, Brianna, Chris, Jane, and everybody.